in the Blitzkrieg, apparently he was massively dependent upon meth, basically, just to keep the troops awake for the however 3 or 4 days it would take to smash through them. It's interesting.
The French are just eating cheese.
Just eating cheese and relying on the Maginot Line or whatever.
A common claim is that dictators cannot be negotiated with. First of all, the Allies side, Stalin was not elected, Francis Charles de Gaulle was not elected, Churchill was appointed by King George, FDR was a tyrant who put 100,000 Americans in internment camps.
Hey, Bob.
Hey, Adam.
You know, I've been hearing a lot lately about this World War I and this World War II, and they're both pretty riveting, I gotta say. You happen to know when the third in the trilogy is coming out?
I think it could be upon us. So.
Any day. Seen any good debates lately?
Yes, ZeroHedge. Our own Keith Knight participated recently, and I thought this would be good fodder for us to go through and analyze.
I think so, too. So this was one of this new series of debates on ZeroHedge. It was hosted by Mario Nawfal, and it was our own, as you said, Keith Knight of the Libertarian Institute, fine fellow. And his opponent was some Brit named Jim Holland. I don't know his position, but he clearly knows what he's talking about. Seemed like a professor, if I'm guessing correctly. He sounded like a professor.
No way for us to know, so we might as well just continue.
I refuse to consult this computer in front of me. Anyway, he did a great job. Keith did a great job, and we are going to talk about it, yes?
Yeah. Do you want to maybe just give our general reactions first, then we'll go through the clips, and then maybe end with some specifics?
Sure. I've listened to it through twice now. First, just because it appeared on my radar, and then again when you thought it might
Second time because you really were hoping the Allies would lose.
Right. It's like, what's going to happen?
It's like the guys in the basement that keep redoing the Civil War.
Right, yeah. What did we do wrong? I thought Keith came with just a fire hose of arguments and bullet points. And Jim Holland's approach was more, again, professorial. He sort of got lost addressing the claims of Keith that the Allies had a bunch of dictators at the helm. So who are they? Who are they to say we can't negotiate with dictators? Seemed like he got lost there a little bit, and then just sort of gave a professorial understanding of the war and what led into America's entering it. And so it seemed like they were talking past each other a little bit, but not completely, which we will get into.
Okay. Yeah, my general thoughts were, I agree with everything you just said, and I would clarify that Holland, if he is a professor, and to the extent you're saying he's given professorial, it's a very conventional professorial.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like, yeah, this is what you would have gotten in your, you know, I wouldn't even say high school history classes or introductory college level in terms of, yep, this is what happened. These are the causes of the war and blah, blah, blah. I will say it was very friendly or cordial. In other words, Holland seemed like he liked Keith and was, probably impressed, like, wow, this is a sharp young lad. I agree with you. I wish the moderator had facilitated more clash. And it's, he didn't do a terrible job. I'm not saying that. It's just, I guess one thing is it was too short, I thought.
It's only an hour.
It was like an hour.
I was just trying to bring that up. Yeah.
Keith's opening statement was like 15 minutes or something, and the other guy, I don't know if he went the full, time, but I mean, they burned like half of the time just on the opening statements. And so I was surprised by that. I actually did ask Keith before we started here, Adam, like, was it supposed to just be an hour or what happened? But he didn't get back to me, so I don't have any inside scoop on that. I will say this, because I feel like I must. And I went into the comments too, and just, it was 95-5 in pro Keith in the comments of the YouTube channel. So I definitely agree, if I'm a judge watching this, I would have to give it to Keith, because you're right. He laid out a very solid case. He clearly had written out his opening statement and was, reading it, and was well paced, and was just kind of a fire hose of information, like you said, with very densely packed nuggets of both, logical argument and historical evidence, whereas the other guy was just kind of, but I mean, FDR and Churchill felt that they had to stop this bad ideology and, they care about democracy. I mean, it was, the guy obviously knew a lot of World War II history, don't get me wrong, but he wasn't, like you say, really grappling too much with Keith's arguments. So in that sense, if I'm judging it like, this is a high school debate and I'm a judge, I'm going to make Keith the winner. But I will say, if I have normie people or like my parents or something, and I wanted them to hear the other side from what they learned growing up about why we had to enter World War II, I wouldn't send them this. That there's no way that Keith would have convinced my parents.
Right.
I'm not, that doesn't mean, so therefore, because Bob Murphy's parents weren't convinced, that wasn't a good, but I'm just saying maybe after we go through the specifics here at the end, I would like to offer some thoughts in terms of maybe a different way Keith could have framed some of this stuff in terms of if his goal were to just reach regular people or let's say like somebody in Tucker Carlson's audience who now they've been primed on a lot of other stuff that if you said, now you want to hear this, case as to why, it would have been fine if the U.S. stayed out of the World War, or not fine, but it would have been better if Roosevelt had stayed out of the war, that kind of thing. So
I guess I was going to save this to the end, but it seems appropriate now. As a rhetorical advice, I do think it's effective to say, yes, I think it was a mistake to enter this war. Look at the horrible outcomes that came from it. Half of Europe is enslaved by Soviet Union. All these people died, a whole bunch of other things. And again, it's persuasive, but I just don't think it's that logical because, strictly speaking, we don't know what would have happened absent us, what actually did transpire. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's just a stronger argument, a logical argument to talk about moral principles and our libertarian political philosophy, why it's wrong on those counts. And I don't know which is more persuasive, but anytime you're trying to fight against a path not chosen, I think it's a little weak.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's one of my go-to arguments back in the days. Like in grad school, I wrote some stuff for LouRockwell.com at one point. I forget what caused it, but somehow I was in this debate, I was writing articles on stuff like this. And that was one of the points I made, that it's a bit weird to say the U.S. government, the Allies had to go into World War II because of the Holocaust. And I was like, yeah, because if they didn't go in there, then 6 million Jews would have died. It's a bit weird. Now obviously you get the point. Is they're saying no, it would have been bigger than 6 million.
Yeah.
Had they not. Right? I understand, but in any event, so anyway, we can maybe save some of that to the end. Let me say before I forget, with all this stuff, this is hindsight's 2020, and even though I'm going to give my thoughts as to here's how someone could have approached this, I have to confess, partly just so if Keith hears this, he doesn't get mad at me or something, or think I'm being unfair. When I was at Freedom Fest one time, I had to, I was doing a debate, and it's awkward because the year before I had crushed. It was on something, it was like a trial of the Fed, and I think I was the prosecuting attorney.
Oh, nice.
And Skousen, Krugman was at that Freedom Fest.
What?
And Skousen was trying to make Krugman to be on the other side. And I was like, oh my gosh, yes, I'll throw in 5,000 myself to make that happen. You know what I mean? Like how awesome that would have been at that event if I was on one side prosecuting the Fed. But Krugman didn't do that. He debated Steve Moore at that. You know what I mean? So anyway, Skousen was trying to get him to do multiple things of that. Anyway. So, but where I'm going with the story is, don't worry, there's a destination. I crushed. I was just on fire. And Kennedy, her, not the former president, not RFK Jr.
Yeah.
She was like the judge. And after my opening statement, she came and hugged me. That's how just, in the zone I was. I had my mojo, right? So I crushed. So, Skousen likes everything. So then the next year, and I had a partner, like it was a tag team thing, so I'm not claiming full, we had witnesses. That's what it was. We were calling witnesses. Okay. So in any event, coming off of that strong victory the next year, it was just me debating some other guy, and the resolution was FDR, a hero for liberty, because the other guy had a book on that. So here I am at the Freedom Fest, audience, whatever. You would think I would just need to show up and say no, thank you, and sit down. And I managed to lose the debate.
Was his whole argument World War II?
Right, and I didn't run from it.
Yeah.
And because I had talked to Scott Horton beforehand, and he kind of convinced me, like, no, Bob, your point is not to win a debate. Who cares? Your point is to reach some people, some young people in the crowd that they might never have heard that. He said, when you're, with events like this, you got to like outright the right and out left the left, that kind of, Horton's strategy.
Right.
And so I went ahead and did that. Okay, Scott. And I went up there and I made the case that FDR was not a hero for liberty because he took us into World War II and he should not have. And I lost at Freedom Fest. The other guy won the debate with the Freedom Fest audience, voting that, yes, FDR, contrary to the Sky Murphy, is in fact a hero of liberty. So anyway, my point is, and I don't remember now, but I think I probably used the techniques that in this episode here, I'm going to end up saying. Now, what he could have done, and I have to admit, and then instead of, having the YouTube comments say you won, you could have had it blown up in your face like happened to me when I tried this. But still, I think it's more effective. I bet you there were some kids in the crowd that were like, this guy's making a lot of sense. I never thought of it like that.
You are a brave and honorable man for telling that story. I don't think I would have done that.
Well, you couldn't have, because no one asks you to debate at Freedom Fest.
I walked into that. But if they had, Bob.
Now, let's take a break for a totally organic conversation about a great company.
Hey, Bob. Remember the merch tables I saw the last time I tabled for the Libertarian Party? Everything went sideways for those guys.
Hard to forget, especially since you've told me 3 times already. What could those poor schlubs do to make things better?
I've been hearing great things about the Swan Brothers. They offer premium gear, embroidered polos, durable tees, and they'll set up a professional online store at no cost. They handle design, printing, and shipping end to end. Lots of options, too. Hats, mugs, bags, even branded socks. And if you run out of sizes on site, they provide a QR code so people can order and have items shipped directly.
That sounds amazing. Who else would that help?
Pretty much anyone. Startups doing promo, nonprofits fundraising, sports leagues outfitting teams, churches, you name it. Quick turnaround, fair pricing, and volume discounts. Take a look at theswanbrothers.com/cross.
Okay, organic conversation over. Back to the show.
All right, you picked out this first clip. What would you like to say about it?
Well, again, it opens up, and Keith went like a good 15 minutes of his opening monologue, and then the moderator gave the other guy a chance. So this is one clip this is for early on. Keith started and said, here are some metrics that I'm going to use as a libertarian. I think he said as a libertarian, I can't remember, to proceed in this debate. And then he went and said, here's what I'm going to argue now, and then launched into this opening salvo. So that's as much as I want to say. And then when we play the clip, then I'll have some commentary.
All right, sounds good. Let's dive right in.
These general metrics in mind, I want to make the case that Britain and the United States should not have entered into the Second World War. Consider this war from the German point of view. Their eastern enemy, the Bolshevik regime, kept engaging in acts of aggression. In 1917, they staged a coup against Tsar Nicholas II and conquered Russia, leading to a 4-year civil war, killing millions of people. In 1918, the Bolsheviks assisted Rosa Luxemburg in the November Revolution, attempting to annex Germany. In 1919, the Bolsheviks invaded Poland, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and set up a puppet state in Hungary with Bela Kun. In 1920, the Bolsheviks occupied Azerbaijan, the same year they occupied Armenia. In 1921, they invaded Georgia. In 1932, they starved millions of Ukrainians to death in the Holodomor. In 1934, the Bolsheviks invaded Xinjiang, China. In 1935, Germany found themselves encircled by the Franco-Soviet Pact, followed by the Czech-Soviet Treaty of Alliance. In 1939, the Bolsheviks invaded Finland and Poland, and by 1940, the Bolshevik regime occupied and annexed Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Romania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina. By 1941, the German National Socialists fought the Russian International Socialists under the guise of opposing the Bolshevik International Worldwide Conspiracy, as Hitler called it in June 22nd, 1941, in his speech. Churchill understood the Soviet menace, saying in a 1920 article titled Zionism versus Bolshevism that Bolshevism is a system of morals and philosophy as malevolent as Christianity was benevolent, and a worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development and envious malevolence and impossible equality. On Germany's western border, they had the British Empire, which comprised nearly 1/4 of the world's land surface and more than 1/4 of the world's population, yet it is Germany who is accused of wanting to take over the world. In the case of Japan, the Chinese communists had been fighting the Chinese nationalists since 1927. America fought a war 6,000 miles away in Korea and 8,000 miles away in Vietnam under the guise of stopping the spread of communism. We can see why Japan, separated from China only by the East China Sea, saw a Chinese communist victory as a potential security threat. Just as you can't rationally analyze a trial only by looking at the prosecution's arguments, you must consider the defense. So too should we consider the point of view of the Axis powers. This nuanced view at least takes us away from the thesis that the Germans were pure, unprovoked evildoers, hell-bent on conquering the world, thus could not be negotiated with and must be bombed into unconditional surrender.
I must say, if I was going to cast a movie with an English history professor, I think I might choose Jim Holland. He's definitely got the look.
Yes. It's funny because you had told me before, like, to watch his reactions when Keith was talking, was because the first time I was just kind of watching Keith, but yeah, I was trying to do that. It was funny. So my the reason I included that selection is the point I wanted to make is I think I totally get what Keith was doing there, but I think it would have been far more effective before he went through that laundry list of things that, the Soviets had done that would, threaten Germany, whatever. At the front end, if he had explained the reason this is relevant is I'm going to try to show you that the Germans, were acting rationally and therefore maybe they could have been negotiated with, right? Because otherwise at the front end, when he just says, let's consider it from their point of view and you go into it, I think some people might have thought like, oh, so you're saying basically the Germans maybe were good guys in this, or like, let's hear it from, and for people who have gotten the normal upbringing, and also for anybody who's, heard the thing about, geez, on the alt-right now, that's like a, Nazi pipeline. I think they might just have recoiled from that, thinking that what Keith is softening us up for here is to tell us that actually Adolf Hitler was the good guy. And clearly that's not what Keith was doing. So anyway, I'm just saying that I think, put it this way, I think what Keith wrote out there for his opening monologue is an essay would be very powerful, but knowing, I'm going to be reading this to people for a debate and they don't know where I'm going and what point I'm making, I think, explaining on the front end, here's the type of argument I'm going to make, here's what I'm going to argue, now here are the specifics. That's my modest point.
I think you're right. It would have been stronger, and even in an essay, you lead with your thesis statement, right? I mean, it is going to help the audience understand these bullet points of information if you've told them what you're about to try and prove. I did think he was making an interesting point. We almost never try to view conflicts from the perspective of the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And like, you'd certainly hope that the politicians and commanders who are in charge of prosecuting the war aren't that myopic, right?
Right.
I mean, I'm a poker player. I'm trying to get inside my enemy's head all the time and stay there. It's how you predict what they're going to do.
Yeah, and I will say too on that, I'm glad he did go through that list because,
yeah,
I mean, it's not like I was a fan of the Soviet Union before, but yeah, I hadn't thought of just how aggressive it had been. Like, I knew that they were awful to their own people, but I didn't consider it like from Germany's point of view, thinking like, yeah, we got to keep an eye on these guys.
And in the aftermath, Yeah, we all know what the Nazis did aggressively to take territory, but look at the world around them. All these other actors, including ones we allied with, they're very, very aggressive and taking territory and authoritarian.
Yeah. And what's funny, too, on that is I know people like to make jokes about, like, the French surrender monkeys, they eat cheese. But, I mean, keep in mind, like, all of Europe had to unite against Napoleon twice, prior to that. Like, so it wouldn't have been crazy for the Germans to be fearful of the threat. And again, part of, like, the whole, like, oh, my gosh, shock of the early days of the war were that the French had the biggest army. Like, they were supposed to be super tough, and that's why it was so shocking when they fell so fast, to the Panzer maneuvers and whatnot. And so, again, this idea that Germany was this big bully just knocking kids off the swings, that's not exactly how it was.
Two things. What's wrong with eating cheese, Bob? Cheese is delicious. Did you happen to see on the Lex Friedman podcast, he interviewed a guy who wrote a book talking about the effects in that war of drugs? Like in the Blitzkrieg, apparently it was massively dependent upon meth, basically, just to keep the troops awake for the however 3 or 4 days it would take to smash through them. It's interesting. I recommend it. Are you ready?
Meanwhile, the French are just eating cheese.
Just eating cheese and relying on the Maginot Line or whatever. Do you have a prefatory statement for clip 2?
Remind me what it is.
I think Keith is making the point about what is a dictator exactly.
This is all. Go ahead, just play it.
Just play it. Oh boy, I hope it's about that. Maybe it's about cheese. Here we go.
A common claim is that dictators cannot be negotiated with. First of all, the Allies side, Stalin was not elected, Francis Charles de Gaulle was not elected, Churchill was appointed by King George, FDR was a tyrant who put 100,000 Americans in internment camps and wrote a letter to Francisco Franco on November 8th, 1942, assuring his friendship with Spain.
So right there, he's addressing the argument that, well, yeah, when it comes to, did the U.S. have to come into the war, or the Allies more generally? Well, yeah, because you got this evil dictator running around murdering people. You got to stop him, right? And you can't negotiate with somebody like that. So, yes, Keith was making the point, like, hang on a second, that Churchill, and that was something, too, I had to go look up, because I knew, famously, Churchill lost his election after the war, and so I had just assumed he'd been elected, during or immediately prior. And I went and looked, and well, no, it was a complicated thing. And Neville Chamberlain's, his party gets, voted no confidence, blah blah blah, and the king, was in charge. So the Holland guy comes in and kind of clarified, and I don't know enough about how the British system works to say, like, yes, it's true, Winston Churchill did not win an election to become prime minister, but what happened there was normal, and they weren't going to have an election in the middle of a war, okay, whatever. But still, that is true. And then de Gaulle, likewise, he was like, the general, and then the French government fell, and then he was in exile, and blah, 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 so it's like he really couldn't have been elected by the French people because, they had a bunch of Nazis goose-stepping around. So, okay, so there's that. But still, it is a little bit a funny thing the way, he put it. And then to go into, though, FDR was a tyrant. I mean, yes, he was. And Keith could say, Bob, why are you objecting to my true statements? But I suppose if what we're trying to do is convince somebody who's on the fence or who just had the standard education of, yeah, we were the good guys and we got this, madman slaughtering 6 million people, what the heck? That to say, well, no, but our guy was a tyrant, anyway, I mean, I think that would just raise the obvious question, like, okay, sure, the Allied leaders weren't angels, but comparatively, who was... And in fairness, even there, you could say, well, Stalin, we allied with him. So clearly it's not that the rule is, hey, if there's a bad guy, we have to go to war with him. So, Keith is on solid ground there. I guess my point is just a more modest one, that he might have phrased that a bit differently, because I think some people would be like, oh, yeah, okay, FDR is the same thing as Hitler. Got it, dude. Libertarian, So.
Yeah, that was my first reaction too, that it was a little hyperbolic, obviously, if you're trying to just have a meeting of the minds. But by your metric, Bob, Keith clearly won this debate, and it was interesting. I doubt it was intentional exactly, but his opponent, Jim Holland, spent half of his 15 minutes addressing specifically those claims.
Right.
And that's, if you're trying to knock your opponent off balance and eat his time, Churchill's not a dictator, and neither is FDR. What are you talking about? And so I don't know. It was fascinating, and it does address directly the claim by the people who insist that we had to fight this war, because they come down all the time on the statement: you cannot have negotiated with Adolf Hitler. He's a dictator. And if that's such a heavy linchpin, okay, well, let's try and knock it out.
Let me say before I forget, just because it might not come up again, but since I brought it up, the one thing for sure I would think that Keith should have worked into his opening thing, especially because he covered so much territory, and he was trying to anticipate, like, now someone might say this, but I would say he literally did not refer to the Holocaust. And that whole thing. And I just think that's a glaring omission, in the sense of, surely a lot of people watching, that's what they would be thinking. Like, okay, yeah, but I mean, if we didn't intervene, then all the Jews get wiped out. So what the heck, dude? And yeah, you're right, FDR is a jerk for interning the Japanese Americans, but I mean, he didn't start exterminating them, so what the hell? And
I think that's a brilliant point. It would have made me laugh, because we don't have this clip, but at one point Keith directly is asked what would he do, and there's some misunderstanding about what would you do about saving the Jewish people as opposed to what would you do about the war. And so Keith launches into directly what he would.
Are you sure we don't have that clip?
No, maybe
I
we
think
do.
That's at the end.
Yeah, if it is.
Unless you didn't listen to my instructions.
I listen to some of your instructions. All right, well, I'll just finish the thought since I opened it up. But yeah, it was funny that they sort of jumped on him for addressing that point when they were thinking he was going to talk about something else. So the third clip I picked out because Jim Holland made some interesting statements. Some of them were economic in nature. Others were about the duties of rich nations or something. So I wanted to play this and then ask you about it.
In terms of Roosevelt's really interesting, because when he canvasses for the presidency in 1932, he does so on the promise of all sorts of different things. And obviously, America is in the mire of the Great Depression, which obviously had been kick-started by the Wall Street crash of October 1929, which in turn had been kick-started by massive overspending and by unlicensed banking, which was borrowing more than they had. So when people started calling it in, bankers were going bust and all the rest of it. But the situation was compounded, of course, by the May 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which kicked off a global trading war and didn't help things at all. And obviously the reason for doing that was benign in its instance and trying to protect American workers. But America by that point was the richest nation in the world. And whether it liked it or not, it might have wanted to go back to a kind of folksy, isolationist, insular-looking situation, but it couldn't, because it is now the richest nation in the world. And being the richest nation in the world comes with international commitments that you just can't get out of, unfortunately.
So, if you don't mind, can we tackle that back to front?
Mm-hmm.
What the heck is he talking about?
I can't, with a straight face, watch the analysis. Bean.
Yeah, it's not this fellow's fault. Yeah, what's he talking about? You can't be a rich nation without being militarily an interventionist, because we have...
No, that's not what he's saying. I mean, what he's saying is goofy, but I don't think that's what he was saying there.
Just please straighten it out for me.
So, I mean, I shouldn't have said that so stridently. You're right. I mean, maybe it's all going along for the ride, but I think there he was making a more narrow economic point, that he was trying to argue the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 is what plunged the U.S. into the Great Depression. And, they meant well. They were trying to protect U.S. workers by shielding them from, cheap imports. But alas, maybe that kind of strategy could have worked when they were just a relatively small, budding country, like in the late 1800s or something, when they were still in its relative infancy, where you could have high tariff barriers and everything and just, trade internally. But once you're this global, the richest country in the world, and you got all this trade flows coming and going, you can't just shut that off. That's not going to work. I think he was trying to say something like that.
Can't shut what off exactly?
Like the international trade flows.
Right, but the debate is about entering the World War II.
Right, but there he was talking about why the U.S. economy was in trouble and so what Roosevelt was dealing with.
I'd be interested in grabbing that fellow and asking a follow-up question. What do you think about his...
Well, can I just go on that?
Yeah, sure.
So, all right, so clearly if he means what you thought, we think he's wrong. But even if he means what I think he meant, it also that's goofy. That no, other things equal, the bigger your economy and the richer you were, the more you could survive autarky.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if you're just some individual guy, you have to trade with others, otherwise you're going to starve to death. Whereas if you and your, if you're living as part of a city and the whole city decides, hey, let's just all trade internally, that's not going to be great, but that's better than some, just guy. And then if you've got the United States and you're the richest country in the world, then, you to just trade internally, you've got some margin of error that you can afford to forfeit. You can, deal with the inefficiencies of high tariffs, right? So that's what I would say. That I think I get what he was trying to say, but on its own terms, it was still a non sequitur. It wasn't even it was a non sequitur. It was still backwards. Like,
sure.
No, other things equal, the richer you were. Like some dinky little country that all they can do is export bananas to get everything else they need. No, if they cut off international trade, their people are going to die.
You make your point very well. I still think I'm right in his interpretation. He says, quote, being the richest country in the world comes with international commitments you can't get out of, unfortunately. And he also says that the Smoot-Hawley tariff triggered an international trade war that literally caused banks in Vienna to collapse and create a political vacuum in the Weimar Republic, ushering in Hitler. Like, I think he's saying, you're so big and you throw your weight around and your mistakes cause World War II. So what? You're not going to come in and try and fix your mess or something?
At this point, we're splitting hairs, but yeah, I strictly speaking, I think what he was saying is it was irresponsible for the U.S. to just think, oh, our stock market crashed, and so we got to help our economy. Well, all I care about is a U.S. worker. Let's just be isolation. I don't care about the rest of the world. Screw them. We're going to have high tariff barriers to raise U.S. wages. And yeah, maybe you could have had that, take my marbles and go home attitude when you were a dinky little country. But now that you're the leading global economic power, you can't do that because look what happened, you geniuses. You just wrecked all the banking centers around the world because you're interconnected with everybody. So yes, he also thinks you have a responsibility, in terms of your military commitment. But I think right there, he was just making a more narrow economic point that don't you realize at this point, the Smoot-Hawley tariff was not only a bad policy, but it was like irresponsible.
Yeah. So, yep. I get that.
And also just real quick, the whole, he's just such a conventional, like, oh, why did the 29 stock market crash happen? Because banks were unlicensed.
Yeah.
Well, they had been unlicensed all through U.S. history up to that point, right? So my standard argument or point on that is that's like when there's a bad plane crash to say what happened. Oh, gravity. Like, okay, but you're not explaining why did that plane crash? So here, why did the 29 crash lead to the Great Depression? You can't say because the banks weren't regulated the way they would be later with Glass-Steagall and blah, 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 and FDIC and because that all came later, right? So how come the Panic of 1819 didn't lead to the worst, what we now think of as the worst recession, depression in U.S. history, right? Why was it this one that was so bad? And the thing that changed was the intervention, that Hoover first and then FDR afterward were the most interventionist in peacetime into the economy. That's what was different from prior episodes. So when you're trying to explain how come this one turned out so badly, it's not because everyone was just so free market back then. No, they had been free market earlier too.
Yep, he is Mr. Conventional Explanation, that's for sure. All right, next clip. Do you remember what it is, Bob?
No, it's about World War II.
It's about World War II. Yeah, here I think Keith is talking about why we don't start wars if we're sensible people. Let's dive in.
So Keith, where would you draw the line? So Jim said the point that France and Britain had to draw the line that, hey, if you invade Poland, we will declare war on you. And there has to be a line drawn. Otherwise, it will continue if you continue appeasing him. In your opinion, what could have or what should have Britain and France have done when Hitler invaded Poland, Hitler and the Soviet Union?
So looking at the specific aims, I think, are important. If it's reunification of Danzig or if it's taking over all of Poland, that is important to consider. Specifying an exact red line for each instance, it is extremely difficult to come up with a metric like that. I think Sir Edward Grey's original position was France is who we could give our war guarantee to. Anything east of that, we're just not able to fulfill in the First World War. I think a more productive answer than saying exactly what geographical area the line should be at is to assume what process should be engaged in if people feel that their freedoms are being threatened or their independence is violated. The two metrics that I think are that governments should use to make sure that the population is actually on board with what their government is committing them to is one, immediately outlaw all conscription. Conscription is an indicator that the people who you're claiming to represent don't actually think something is worth fighting for. And second, taxation and central banking. You should not be allowed to fund wars through any of those involuntary means. Governments should have to sell war bonds and get soldiers voluntarily.
Don't start wars if you can't do so without conscription, taxation, and a central bank. That sounds like a pretty good idea. I like that pivot. I mean, I don't know if it's going to reach anybody, but I thought it was a great way to sort of judo move the question.
Yeah, and that's why I include the clip, because it was really interesting. I should probably say, I realize I'm coming off like hard on Keith, perhaps. The reason we're clipping him is because he was interesting. Like the other guy was just like conventional stuff that you learned, from your history class or something. So it's not that the other guy was crushing it and we have nothing to say. It's that Keith's stuff provides fodder for conversation. So yeah, I should have said on that one to explain the context that, the Holland guy and the moderator, who's clearly like taking Holland's side, generally speaking, are, was saying, well, geez, I mean, they kept trying to appease Hitler, and at first they didn't go to war. They let him the Sudetenland and blah, blah, blah. And then, but finally, he just kept violating his word, and they drew a line in the sand at Poland. And then that's what, okay, well, we told you no, so now we got to go to war. And, okay, maybe not Poland, but what, France? Like, so Keith, where would you just let Hitler do whatever the heck he wants and never go to war? Like, where would the line in the sand be according to you? And so I did like that Keith, didn't just say, oh, I would have drawn it at this particular point. And that, like he was acknowledging that's kind of a difficult question to address. And so, yeah, the way I like how he pivoted and said, instead of like the specific strategy, like here's the technique. And I would say, I think the conscription one was excellent. Like, I think a lot of people, like the kind of person that Keith can hope to appeal to in this, like not just preaching to the choir, but also not preaching to the Satanists, that's somebody about the conscription. Whereas with the taxes, I thought, nah, that's probably not going to resonate with anybody. Again, he's not wrong, but I'm just saying in terms of like what the point of doing this is you're trying to grab people that are on the fence and bring them over. And I was thinking through like why do I have that response? And I think it's for this reason that right now the U.S. doesn't have conscription. And so Americans now, certainly people under 40 or whatever, have grown up thinking that's the normal state of affairs. the U.S. government is certainly capable of waging war nonstop around the world, relying on a volunteer military, right? So they think that's normal. And the idea of, what if the government said you had to go overseas and fight, like that horrifies people. And they think, no, we can get by just fine without that, because in their experience, that's been the case. Whereas to say, well, what if, the government should have, they should have thought about fighting Hitler, but they can't use taxes. And I think some people be like, well, not only would we not have stopped the Holocaust, we wouldn't even have roads. So how is that going to work? You know what I mean? And like selling bonds, but if you don't have taxes, how are you going to pay the bondholders? Like what? I don't, So I just think that was too much to ask of people, especially because Keith knew like he doesn't have time to fill that out. You know what I mean? Like if he had taken 5 minutes of his opening 15 to devote to that, okay, but he would have to spell it out more. So anyway, like I said, I agree with you. I thought that was a great move, but I think it probably would have landed better if he had just brought up the conscription part and just said, right there, you do a conscription, that's proven that the people are not on board. And, if somebody, like, do you think when the Nazis actually were in France that the French people had to be conscripted? No, of course not. They were the vigilante groups, afterward even when it was illegal and the Vichy government had surrendered and they were traitors at this point. There's still the resistance was doing pot shots, so no, you don't need to force people to defend their homeland. What you do need to do is force them to go, overseas to something that's not their business, right? So I think relying on that would have been a lot more effective with a larger segment of the audience.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. And we're giving him a little bit of crap when he didn't have an unlimited amount of time. I mean, I think he could have landed all 3 points with an opening and closing thesis statement like, isn't it amazing how much more frequently politicians will drag their countries and their people into war when they can do so via conscription, via taxation, via inflation. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I love the fact that he pivoted like that. We have one clip left. Shall we just dive in, or do you have anything to say?
So I think for this one, yes, going along with the same technique, where it's kind of like the Holland guy, he wasn't really even disagreeing. I mean, he was nitpicking certain points, like you said, like, yeah, Churchill wasn't elected, but I mean, come on, this is the way the parliamentary government works, and blah blah blah. Yeah, okay, and I agree. Firebombing Dresden, sure, killed a lot of babies. That's probably but when you think about it, what they're trying to do, and he was just kind of doing that. Like he wasn't really saying anything Keith said was wrong. It was more like it was a difficult situation the Allies were in. No matter what they did, it was going to suck. And hey, they thought they were doing the lesser of 9 evils. And so then at this point, we already heard where he was saying, well, where would you have drawn the line, if anywhere, in terms of just sitting back and letting Hitler, aggress more and more? When do you stand up to the bully? And then here, likewise, as a similar kind of framing of just, okay, well, what would you have done then? Like, how would you have prevented the war or something? And he was and I think if I am remembering the clip correctly, he did bring up the Holocaust at this point. Holland did. And say, I mean, Keith, you're talking about this, and the Allies, and Stalin went on to do some horrible things, and no one's doubting that. But I mean, look at this murderous ideology of Adolf Hitler and the Holocaust and so forth, and he had to be stopped. And so, you're making a bunch of valid points here, Keith, about self-government and blah blah blah. But what would you have done in the face of this evil ideology and this regime?
Yeah, while we're on the subject. The guy's super conventional, but he was an honest actor, I think, and he wasn't just ignoring Keith. He didn't have that much to say in response because he's making all these claims about self-government and the will of the people. And it's like, well, wasn't Danzig 95% German?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did those people have any say? And another good one, they used it as the opening clip where Keith is saying, I just don't believe that Britain in particular was so offended by Hitler's invading Poland. Should they have declared war on Russia when Russia invaded Poland? And the guy's like, well, that's a good question. Do I really believe the reasons for the war that I've just been spending half an hour telling you what these reasons are?
Yeah, I'm glad you remembered that. And yes, folks, they did. So by all means, go ahead and watch the debate. We're just giving you snippets. But yeah, they opened with that, and the guy was like Douglas Murray never would have said that.
Right, exactly.
You know what I mean? So
exactly.
I do agree with you that the guy was really just listening to what Keith said and trying to answer him. And when Keith had a good zinger, the guy was just like, "Huh, I don't know. That's a good question."
And I think we'll get to it a little bit later, but like he wasn't saying Keith was wrong about all these atrocities. He was just like, "What are you going to do? The Holocaust and Hitler's going to literally take over the world," which is in the clip we're about to talk about. So, shall we?
Yes, I hope it is. Otherwise, I got mixed up.
Well, I'm
We'll find
having
out
the
soon
same
enough.
same
I'm on
delusion.
the edge of my seat here.
What's he going to say?
We don't know about the Holocaust in 1940, but we do know about systemic anti-Semitism and a whole host of other horrors. And obviously that develops into the Holocaust. You know, the 6 million Jews that were murdered. And, you know, what is amazing about that is in May 1940, the moment that, you know, Germany can't possibly win the war by this point. They accelerate the extermination of the Jews by going into Hungary and pulling out all the Hungarian Jews and hurrying them to Auschwitz as quickly as possible. The famous railway track that goes under the main arch in Auschwitz-Birkenau, the death camp, was built specifically to speed up the execution of Hungary's Jews. You know, so it's you know, that ideology, had they been successful, would have just got worse and worse and worse, and there'd be more people. There wouldn't just be Jews, there'd be other people that they've decided to isolate. You know, it would progress and progress and progress until the only people around are Northern European Aryan types. I mean, you can see how this would escalate. And okay, so you could argue and say, well, maybe it wouldn't. Maybe Hitler would have halted. Well, you know, who would bet against it? That's the point.
Yeah,
Yes.
so Keith, there's a final question.
So then what do you do?
What would you, Keith? What
just sit
would
back
you?
and let it happen?
Exactly. That would be the question. What could have been done differently, Keith,
I
that
would
have led to a better outcome?
I would have appointed Charles Lindbergh to negotiate with the German Zionist Federation of 1897, who was still active in 1933, Hitler's Germany, and I would have accelerated the Havara Agreement, which was the transfer of Jews 1,800 miles away from Germany, which the National Socialist government did approve of, to get them into Palestine. Form an alliance with the Zionists and the National Socialists. Well, not like a military alliance, but there could have been a transfer program that was referred to as the Havara Agreement. That could have gotten Jews away from this very hostile situation without leading to mass death.
Wow.
But that wouldn't have prevented World War II. I don't know how that relates.
Your
to
question was
war in
about
general.
your question was his question was about what to do with the Jews who were victims of the Holocaust. So I was saying accelerate an alliance with the German.
No, so I'll rephrase. So I apologize. So what would you have done as a final question? What would you have done differently to avoid a world war, to end it in let's say Poland or France?
In Poland or France, pretending that I would have the knowledge to answer something as specific as that, I think Churchill brings up very good points when it comes to France responding to the violation of the Versailles Treaty, when it comes to reoccupying the Rhineland. That was a very good potential show of force, because Churchill's reasoning is that at the time France could have mobilized 70 divisions, whereas the Germans only would have had roughly a dozen. I think that is very important. He says if we had strongly enforced sanctions against Italy, that would have shown that the League of Nations is not just something on paper that we discuss. That was an off-ramp, so I am designating to a high authority Winston Churchill on this. But he does say that the declaration of war over Poland was an extremely weak justification at the most unfavorable of times, now that Germany had gotten so much stronger. However, you also have to consider that the more war guarantees you give, the more claims you make on the earth, those are all potential assets for your empire. Also, those are liabilities, and you have to spend a great deal of resources subjugating people, printing money to pay for the soldiers, to generate the equipment that the soldiers have. So you end up spreading yourself so thin. That's how, after the First World War, you saw the fall of the Tsarist Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Kaiser Wilhelm's Empire. They spread themselves too thin. So I don't think it's terrible to say, well, Frederick the Great is conquering land, so therefore George Washington must declare war. He didn't. When Otto von Bismarck was invading countries and killing innocent people in the Franco-Prussian War, Ulysses S. Grant did not declare war over this. We didn't even really get involved in the Napoleonic battles to a significant degree.
Well, but America is not an international nation in the way that it is by the middle of by the third of the 20th century. That's the point, and the threat is contained to the United States in Europe in the 1860s and 1870s in a way that it isn't by the 1940s. I think that's the point. That's the point that Roosevelt's making, is that the world is getting a smaller place. It's shrinking. The technology is advancing at such a rate. The barriers of the Pacific and the Atlantic are not what they were. So that's why they have to get involved, or else the fear is that this becomes a global cancer that spreads across the entire planet.
I'm reminded that it was that passage there that made me think that Jim Holland thinks that simply because America is big and a, quote, international country, that we were supposed to steam all the way over to Europe and get involved. Remarking on our previous argument discussion.
Yes, he does think that. But I'm just saying, I thought in that earlier one, the context there, he was just, it was flowing from the economic considerations. So yes, he does think that, just like he thinks 2 + 2 is 4, presumably. But I don't think that was spilling out from that discussion of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs.
And they're both equally logically flawless. I loved Keith's explanation about, everyone says if we didn't join in World War II, Hitler would have conquered the globe. And Keith was saying things about, stretching yourselves thin, resources. I just kept picturing that old game of Risk. Did you ever play that when you were a kid? Yeah. And one of the beautiful things about it is even if you win the battle and conquer the territory, you've got to leave some of your resources behind as you move across the board. So that even while you win, you're draining resources, and eventually you're just like, well, I've won 7 in a row, but now I don't even have enough to fight the next battle. And so, like, what do you think? Everyone always assumes that these people want to conquer the globe, and that's why we've got to stop them at the very first step and never make any appeasement, even if it makes some sort of sense based on the history of the last 2 or 3 decades. Do you think, how should we evaluate arguments like that, or do you think about it like that?
Okay, yeah, so a lot there. Before I forget, I was intrigued by Keith's original, when he thought the question was narrowly, well, geez, look at all those Jews that died in the Holocaust. What do you say to that? And I think he was saying, like, I would have accelerated the Zionist program, which I wasn't expecting some of the Libertarian Institute to say.
He said an alliance between the Zionists and the National Socialists. Yeah, that was a hell of a line.
So, yeah, like, if establishing Israel in, 48 was a good idea, doing it in 33 would have been even better. So anyway, that was interesting. I wasn't expecting that. But again, too, in terms of, like, the other guy, like, you could just see, he was like, what's this kid talking about? Like, it was, and to his credit, like you said too, he wasn't like, he could have pounced and be like, that's the stupidest, you know what I mean?
No,
like,
he didn't do that.
He didn't treat him like Mark Levin would have or something. So right. I can give him credit for that. Okay. So anyway, again, it was nice. Like that Keith was really thinking. Also, before I forget too, Keith obviously has just read a ton of stuff on this. I mean, he knows way more about this period or world history than I do. So none of this should be construed as me saying, geez, if I had been there, I would have said, like, that's not at all what I'm saying here. But I do think, so yes, I agree with everything you said, Adam. And I was intrigued. I thought it was interesting for him to relate it to, like, our heroes, like George Washington is a good guy. And then to just show, well, Washington didn't intervene in this, and to go through. So that was nice, like to say, oh yeah, the period when we think of the golden ages of the United States and whatever, and our founding father, like, they weren't dabbling in fact. They explicitly said we shouldn't do that. That's interesting. Yeah. So, all that's great. Still, though, I feel there could have been, because I think that was the lingering thing. I think, all the stuff Keith had set up to that point, most people watching, if they were fair, would say, yeah, okay, yep, okay, yeah, right. But still, just, yeah, but Hitler was such a bad guy, and we're just going to sit back and let him go around and do all this naughty stuff. And so, if I may, can I share, this is something I grabbed, some academic professor's deal, and he was relying, this guy Goldsmith wrote something like in 46 or something. He worked in like the U.S. War Munitions Board or something. Okay, so take these figures with a grain of salt, but I've seen things that are like this elsewhere too, right? So I think this is ballpark correct. All right, so or for those listening just in the audio version, it's a table showing volume of combat munitions production of the major belligerents from 1935 through 44, annual expenditure in billions of dollars, Right, so with this stuff, it's money terms, and these are different countries, and like, what does it mean to talk about dollar expenditures in the USSR? Take this stuff with a grain of salt, but still, just to get a sense, and where I'm going with this is to show this notion that, geez, the U.S. had to intervene because otherwise we'd all be speaking German. That is so ludicrous for people to talk like that if you just know anything about the size of the relative size of the economies. All right, so in particular, let me just point out that at its peak, the German war machine in 1943, according to these figures, was producing $13.5 billion in annual war expenditures. Whereas in that year, the U.S. was $38 billion. And then in 44, the Germans peaked at 17. So they both peaked in 1944. And the Germans were at 17 billion and the U.S. was at 42. Okay, so, just more than double. And also, like, the idea, look at how hard it was for Germany to cross the Channel, right? The Battle of Britain that they ended up losing. So Germany is going to cross the ocean and conquer the entire continental United States and occupy it with those long supply lines. The Americans are just going to be sitting around when they can produce more than double of what the Germans can. Like, that's goofy. That's not, and as I like to say, no matter what, not even the Nazis could get Americans to learn a foreign language. So, no, the United States, the Americans would never have been speaking German no matter what. So, I didn't just prove, therefore, the U.S. entering the World War II was a bad idea, but I'm saying this idea that, well, geez, Hitler was just going to be picking people off, and then the U.S. was, down the, like, no, absolutely not. Like, look at the trouble the U.S. had in Afghanistan. Do you really think Germany could have occupied the United States of America in 1947? Like, are you out of your mind? That's just, people talking like that just have no conception. All right. And I've seen that he saw that quote attributed to some Japanese admiral saying,
awakened a tiger or something.
Well, yeah. After
giant.
Bombing Pearl Harbor, so yeah, we awakened a sleeping giant. But there was this other quote attributed to someone. Later, I saw that it might have been apocryphal, but the saying goes that some Japanese admiral, or maybe he was a general, said, we can never invade the mainland United States because there'd be a rifle behind every blade of grass. Something like that. Like, because that's another thing, too, is that Americans were armed, whereas some peoples around the world, their governments, like, well, no, they can't have weapons, otherwise they could stand up to us. So, again, Germany couldn't have taken Texas, right? Like, right. So there's no way they're going to take all of the United States. Come on. I mean, just look at a map. And just look at what that would entail. So, okay, so there's that. So I guess in terms of, all right, Murphy, what was you said? I think that could be a starting point. Like, again, speaking to an American audience. And again, Adam, like, to your point, there's a difference between what's the ethically correct from the perspective of the heavens argument versus if you're just trying to convince some normal Americans, like, hey, what your teacher taught you was probably wrong, and let me show you this perspective. I think just saying, like, no, the U.S. would have been all the thousands of American casualties and stuff. We didn't need any of that. Like, the stuff about, geez, we melted a bunch of Japanese babies. Should we have done that? Well, if we didn't, then all these American soldiers, well, no, not if we just stayed out of it. Right. So that all that goes away. And then when you say, okay, but geez, that would have given Europe over to this dictator and millions would have died, and say, right, and that's what happened with the Soviet Union and the Gulag, and Stalin killed more people than Hitler did, right? So, or more of his own people than Hitler did. So anyway, I'm just saying, I think, you could make a case from that perspective to just show that all the stuff you're listing as to what would have happened had the U.S. not entered the war did happen with the U.S. entering the war. So this idea that, it arguably could have been a lot better. And yeah, there would have been the balance of power, and then we might not have had the Cold War and all the horrors that happened there, all the tens and tens and tens of, millions of people dying for all those things. So anyway, and you could, last thing I'll say, and I'll shut up here, is with all this stuff, I mean, it's not even a nut job conspiratorial view. It's a respectable opinion among historians. I don't know if it's a majority view, but it's certainly respectable among mainstream historians to say if the U.S. had stayed out of World War I, there would have been a negotiated peace, and then things might have been better in the 20th century than what happened. And so with all these things, and they got into it in this debate too, where Keith was talking earlier about, well, they could have done this differently and whatever, and saying, yeah, but they didn't. If we're looking right at 1939, what do we do? With all these things, the U.S. shouldn't have gotten into World War I, and then we wouldn't, Hitler wouldn't have been an issue. Okay, but we did. All right, well, then they shouldn't have done this. They shouldn't have, dropped, they didn't need to, drop the A-bomb on Hiroshima. Okay, but so with all these things, then there wouldn't have been the Cold War. At any point, you can just say, if they didn't do that, then a bunch of stuff that followed might not have happened. And yeah, it's arbitrary to pick, well, where all of a sudden you're going to say, assume everything's happened up to here. Now what do you do? And all those, each successive intervention makes it more painful no matter what you do down the road, but that's not an argument to just keep doing the thing that's not working. You know what I mean? So
I sure do, yeah. There was one interesting part where Jim Holland was grappling with something really interesting, like him in this debate, and everyone who says that what happened in World War II was what we had to do. There was no other thing we could have done. And these people always firmly stress the unique evils of the Nazis and the thing we just went through. Hitler was completely unstoppable. He was a madman. He would have conquered the whole globe. And whether those things are true or hyperbolic, I think the people who are analyzing World War II kind of need them to be true because of an issue Jim Holland was grappling with. I wish I'd grabbed the clip. I'm going to quote him, and it's not an exact quote, but it's very, very, very close paraphrase. He was saying, "It's an interesting question for those on the side of the moral right. It starts to get murky when you're destroying cities and civilians with firebombing and nukes. How much bad do you have to do to do good? And, if you're not a psychopath, you're horrified at the firebombing of Tokyo and Dresden and dropping 2 nukes and all the other horrible things. So if you're going to be able to sleep at night, you really do need to magnify the threat that you committed these atrocities to stop." And I found it refreshing and interesting that he wasn't trying to sweep it under the the issue under the covers. He wanted to grapple with it, and I appreciated that he did that.
Yeah, on the firebombing stuff, I think some people might not realize, what they would do. It wasn't that the fires were an unintentional byproduct. The point was to start a conflagration. Yeah. And in fact, they would do it in waves. So they would send the initial wave, a bunch of buildings, in major population centers to be on fire. They would wait so that the fire trucks and stuff would come. Then they would send a second wave to knock out all of the fire suppression emergency vehicles and whatever, so that they had no capability of stopping the inferno. And the idea was we want to destroy as much of this, this property as possible. I don't know whether the explicit goal was to kill as many people as possible, but definitely to displace as many as possible. And we're not saying, because then they couldn't go to the factories. I mean, yeah, sure, but mostly just to terrorize them so that, either their government just says we can't do this, or the people say to their government, we have to make peace because this is unacceptable. And, in other contexts, using violence to terrify people to achieve your political aims. There's a term for that, and we're not generally in favor of it. So,
yeah, for sure. So that's all I had to say, except that I really thought Keith did a great job. I liked how unique his arguments were and his takes were. I could quibble about presentation or whatever, but I thought he did a great job, and it's a debate that's worth watching a couple times. I hope a lot of people do, just to take seriously the points he was making. And I thought the other guy did a decent job too. He was cordial, respectful. He listened. He wasn't a liar. He was just very, 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 very conventional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agree with all that. And even on the points of like the issue, I'm kind of conflating now because I just recently heard on the Provoked podcast where Scott asked Daryl once again, for the people that just saw that clip of you on, because I think Ben Shapiro played it when he was doing his Tucker hit piece.
Yeah.
Why did you say Winston Churchill was the chief villain? And Daryl, in this particular exposition, said some stuff that I hadn't heard him say before.
Yeah.
And talk, he's in general, I've heard him talk about like the various off ramps or whatever, but just going through and just showing the timeline, the chronology of like when the bombing of the city started, and the Hitler's generals were saying to him, we can't just sit there and let them hit our cities like this. And it was like, no, we don't want to provoke this. We got so, and Keith worked in a lot of points like that here too, just kind of showing, say what you will about him, but it's not that Hitler was this, like, it wasn't even in his interest, right? So he was conquering people, and was a military strategist. People can argue that later on, he sort of went insane or whatever. But the point being, up front, he didn't want war with Britain. Like, that's, you can argue he was biding his time and eventually he would have. Okay, but up front, definitely the Allies were the ones that provoked the larger conflict. And I think Keith, did a good point of, bringing those facts up, and the other guy didn't challenge that stuff. So I think the audience could see, like, right. Oh, okay, yeah. So, it's not that Winston Churchill was this angel and Adolf Hitler was the devil. Like, no, right. There were a lot of sins committed on both sides.
History is complicated. Shall we wind it down?
I think so.
If you're all fans of Haman Nature, God bless you, please go check out BobMurphyShow.com. He's got a bunch of interesting articles or shows that I'm not on. And if it is more likely the case that you are a Bob Murphy fan, please go to youtube.com/@Haman Nature, HAMAN Nature, and like and subscribe on my channel so I can get monetized and take over the universe, much like Hitler wouldn't do, we hope. This was awesome, Bob. Great idea. It was a fun debate to analyze and talk about. So thank you for that, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.